Okay, sorry for the delay. Now, I'll be honest with you, today's class is again a bit too conceptual for my taste. I showed you all the videos that were somewhat entertaining last week. But as usual, I'll let you know what matters and what will help you get, I hope, a good result on your term test. So for no other reason, bear with me. So far, we've discussed how economic activity is organized over space. We've discussed various ways by which people transact. We've discussed everything from supply and demand to auctions. We've discussed the role of government. But then what the authors do, and it is somewhat unusual in the context of an economic geography course, they introduce what is sometimes called the third sector or nonprofit organizations. So it might be that some of you have already volunteered for such organizations, but the way they do it is somewhat ageographical. At least they discuss them within the context of specific country, and they want to show you how important they have become over time. But they also present them as a type of institution that tries to fill a gap between people who will provide services for other people for money, people who will provide services for other people sometimes without charges, but by relying on taxation, therefore government. The nonprofit sector, as the name implies, is not trying to make money out of its customers, but at the same time, it cannot rely on coercion in terms of extracting money from other people. Okay, so they begin with a quote by an heterodox economist of some standing named Herman Daly. So Daly is one of the founders of something called ecological economics. Now, I don't know if you're introduced to that on this campus, but basically what these people try to do is, in a way, merge biology and economics. So instead of looking at economic reality strictly from the perspective of individual economic agents or firms, they try to look at it as the actions of an organism, human beings, but within its broader physical context. But Daly came to ecological economics because he was critical of what would be taught in Economic 101 and most other courses. And one of his criticisms has long been that the individualistic characteristic of Homo economicus, his point is that they're not people, but economic agents are only in it for themselves, they only care about profits, and it is from this assumption of self-interested behavior that microeconomics then proceeds. But Daly is a person who wants to introduce other characteristics within economics. He wants to introduce what makes us humans rather than simple economic agents. So fairness, malevolence, benevolence, the preservation of human life, and other moral concerns. Now, Daly comes at this from the perspective of an environmentalist and someone from the left, but not mentioned in the textbook is that there are other people who come from this perspective from free market economics, but what they emphasize instead is voluntary action. So they also reject the notion that economics should be studied strictly through the lens of economic agents who try to maximize their interest. But they point out that all these characteristics that Daly is fond of can be found in the voluntary actions of people through their churches, through various organizations. And a representative blog of that is called Bleeding Heart Libertarians. So I don't know if you can see the subtitle in the back, but it's called Free Markets and Social Justice. And unlike most people, people who come from this perspective believe that the two are spontaneously compatible, because once people have reached a certain level of material comfort, they tend to look out for other people. They have the time and the resources to do so. Okay, but as far as the book chapter is concerned, what Ader and Patchell do is explore why nonprofit organizations, and I'll refer to them as NPOs from now on, exist in the first place, what role they can play in local and global development, What's interesting is that they also discuss how they attempt to influence market behavior and government policies. So if you don't already know this, what you'll learn in the coming hour is that there are some NPOs that do things, and then there are other NPOs who specialize in telling other people what to do. And then they try to assess how NPOs serve non-material goals of market economies. So try to do good things, but that are not necessarily profitable. And then how they can actually facilitate economic development by making some locations more pleasant places to live in the first place. Okay, so the authors, I will expect you to remember these things here. The way they define nonprofit organizations or non-governmental organization, and they have something of a distinction between the two, is by their goals. And so what they say is that they address the non-material values of society that are not served well or even damaged by business and governments. So there are obviously people who have money in the free market, and in their case, getting health care, getting education is not a problem. Now you've got governments who do a number of things, but sometimes they don't have the resources or the will to do some good things. Either they don't have enough money, or some politicians believe that doing certain things is not within the purview of government. And so it is in that context that nonprofit or non-governmental organizations can step in and fill that void. So what I will ask you also to remember is that NPOs and NGOs are similar to other organizations, but they don't have legislative powers, they do not profit shareholders, they're self-governing, they're socially motivated, and they create and maintain social capital. Each of these will now be examined in turn. So nonprofit organizations are roughly 5% of global gross domestic product. Again, this is not that most NGOs create value per se, but some of the value that is created by other people gets rechanneled into a non-governmental organization. And they represent a fair number of jobs, and they provide a number of services. So it's estimated that in rich economies, nonprofit organizations will employ between 4 to 10% of the workforce. And these things will depend on whether or not, for example, you calculate the private schools as being part of the government or being part of the nonprofit sector. So in some places, roughly 1 out of 10 jobs are related to nonprofit organizations. But again, these can be schools, these can be research laboratories, these can be people that feed the poor, and a few other things. So the largest employers in the budgets, they were obviously in health and education. So a number of hospitals, for example, are nonprofit organizations, and they do employ a lot of people. Universities, if they're not run by the state and their employees therefore not considered state employees, will also employ a large number of people who will be classified as working in the nonprofit sector. So as the authors also tell you, nonprofit organizations are remarkably diverse and can be classified, and this I will ask you to remember too, as either being expressive, social, as providing social services, or having an advocacy function. So you can speak on behalf of people, you can provide the need for people, or you can deliberately try to influence government policies so that the government actually takes care or sets up programs to address certain needs that they deem important, and so that they can provide services which they deem valuable. So it's argued that in some cases, nonprofit organizations sometimes function as shadow states or countervailing power. So a typical example here would be building pipelines. So I don't know how many of you watch the news in this respect, but if you do pay even distracted attention to the issue, you will see that in many places where corporations want to build pipeline, you will see a number of opponents perhaps camping in a particular area, perhaps pressuring politicians against building a pipeline. And so in that context, NPOs or activists describe themselves as speaking on behalf of voiceless people or people who don't have much say when governments and corporations agree on a certain objective that will have important implications for the lives or the environment in which certain people live. Okay, so what is the role of nonprofit organization in terms of realizing non-market value? Again, I'm not going to get into the details, but markets, as we've discussed, are characterized by things like private property rights. So you own something, you have the right to, let's say, some physical stuff or intellectual property. You transact it for money with other people. When the trade is mutually beneficial, there is a profit. When resources are misallocated, there is a loss. If you want to be a profitable business, you need to make profit in the long run. You cannot systematically lose money and obviously stay in business. Governments run based on their capacity to collect taxes, among other things. I know there's a debate about printing money and those issues, but this is not something I want to discuss in this class. And the nonprofit sector is basically everything else. Religious organizations, nonprofit organizations, again, set up to provide social services, healthcare, arts and culture, international aid, and stuff like that. So this is something I took from the web. This is not from the textbook. So this is a way to describe the actions of some organizations. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Amnesty International, for example. This is an organization that was created to fight for the freedom of nonviolent political activists. And historically, Amnesty International would stay away from people who had committed violent acts to promote their cause, even if their cause may have seemed legitimate at the time. You have other organizations like Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth who specialized in dealing with environmental issues, so everything from global warming to deforestation in the Amazon to the type of plastics that is used in baby bottles, things like that. You have other nonprofit organizations who advocate on behalf of greater social equality. So all this talk that you've heard about the 1%, for example, was not very common until maybe 5 years ago, but various NGOs pushed a notion that, there was the 1% and there was the rest of us. And you have other organizations who advocate on behalf of poor people, either in advanced economies or less advanced economies, and they promote various approaches and solutions to deal with that. Now in Canada, you've got a number of those, culture and recreation. So if any of you have played organized sports when you were younger, chances are that a nonprofit organization was involved, if not in completely running the organization, at least that a number of people volunteered through a nonprofit to organize hockey tournaments and things like that. Education and research, health, the environment, housing, so Habitat for Humanity, things like that. And a number of churches, of course, are obviously nonprofit organizations, and they will be involved in a number of advocacy related issues or direct actions. Now in the United States, you've got a huge number of nonprofits, per capita much higher than in other parts of the world, and that's among other things because you've got so many churches in the United States. And whether or not you count churches as a nonprofit often determines how you look at certain issues. So for example, if you look at foreign aid, Americans are often described as being rather cheap in this respect because their government does not give as much per capita as other countries. But if you factor in all the money that American churches do send in less advanced economies, then on a per capita basis, Americans are actually more generous than most other people in advanced economies. Okay, but as the authors remind us, the majority of nonprofit organizations are small and serve local communities. So, everything from organizing hockey tournaments to local churches to promoting community development, opposing a highway, promoting the construction of a hospital, providing social services, running a local museum, what have you. Now you've got national and international organizations which are much larger. I mean, obviously they all began small. Greenpeace, for example, began when a few hippies decided to protest nuclear testing in the Pacific. They then reoriented their activities towards saving the whales. So it began as a small organization based in Vancouver, but now it is a very large international organization. And the last time I checked, they were based in the Netherlands. So nonprofit organizations are often highly geographically mobile, but they can also act locally in remote places quickly. So you've got organizations that specialize in disaster relief. So you've got a drought, an earthquake, a flood. You've got very professional organizations, World Vision or things like that, which have the logistic works to a T, and they can provide relief in disaster areas rather more quickly than government in many cases. So again, a number of organizations are truly international. So Oxfam began as a religious organization. You could argue it kind of wears its religion lightly these days, but it is involved in a number of countries the world over. So they're obviously based in advanced economies, but they provide most of their services in less advanced ones. Okay, so as with everything else, in terms of social services, big NGOs began small. Most NGOs began small. A lot of them did not survive, and most of these organizations remain small to this day. So in Western economies, historically, churches and charities often affiliated with churches would provide social services. So I grew up in Quebec, which historically was a Catholic colony. You could not migrate to Canada from France if you were a Protestant. At the time Canada was settled. And so for much of its history, educational and charitable services in Quebec was provided either directly by the Catholic Church or through organizations that were affiliated with the Catholic Church. So everything from building hospitals to collecting clothing for poor people typically ran through Catholic organizations. But of course the same was true for other churches, depending on the size of the church and how involved they were in their communities. Historically, most organizations were created that way. Up until the emergence of the welfare state a few decades ago, you also had mutual societies. So let's say workers in a particular line of work would create a nonprofit in order to have access to affordable insurance, mortgages, and things like that. But again, the picture is complex, and a lot of these functions in terms of social services were actually began by nonprofit organizations, but in many economies were then taken over by the state. So the rationale here is that private markets are very good in terms of providing things to people who have the means to pay for them, but obviously the people who require social services more than others typically don't have these means. So historically, wealthier people who wanted to show their civic spirit would create organizations or would get involved with their church to provide various kinds of social services. Nonprofit organizations are business, though, in the end, and from time to time you've got reports of how much professionals are paid within nonprofit organizations. And there's often a bit of a scandal in terms of how well paid some of the managers of these organizations are. But then what these organizations will tell you is that, if you want talent, you've got to pay for it, because if people can earn twice as much money or 3 times the salary in the for-profit sector, no matter how devoted they are, the temptation might be too strong for them to work in the private sector, the for-profit sector, as opposed to the nonprofit one. So A number of jobs in nonprofit organizations are actually fairly well paid. Now, whether or not, as someone who gives money to this organization, you believe the compensation is right or not, well, ultimately, unlike other types of organization, you can decide to give or withdraw your support if you agree or not with their management practices. But what has happened also in the last few decades is that historically, nonprofit organizations would collect monies in various ways, but increasingly they've become agents of the state. So a number of organizations get their money ultimately from taxpayers, but directly from the government. And whether this is good or bad depends on your perspective. If you work for the government, you can view them as a form of cheap labor competing with you. If you look at them from the perspective of a taxpayer, if you think that your tax dollars actually provide better care through a nonprofit organization rather than through a government agencies, you might consider this, again, a better use of your money. But again, we could look at a number of case studies. There are pros and cons to both approaches. Okay, some types of nonprofit social services. If some of you ever got in trouble with the authorities in your wild youth, you might be familiar with youth services and youth welfare agencies, so delinquency prevention services and other issues. Family services, service for the handicapped, service for the elderly, temporary shelters, refugee assistance. So there are a number of organizations around us. We often don't notice them until we need them or until we get to know someone who actually needs them. But there's typically a lot of services provided, either for people whose family has been in a country for a very long time or other types of services targeted towards more recent immigrants. But again, there's this big controversy about the shadow state, and this I will ask you to remember because this is really what people will debate at the most abstract level regarding nonprofit organizations. So on the one hand, you've got serious needs. On the other, you've got government who've run out of money because government employees are paid fairly well. Because once you hire them, they're kind of hard to let go, even if you don't require their services anymore. There's been a lot of economic pressures on governments who are trying to balance their budget or to cut back on certain forms of spending to offload social service provision to nonprofit organizations. So the rationale is that localities are better served locally. So if you have a nonprofit organization that's been, providing shelters in a city for, 150 years, it might have begun as a church organization. Well, it makes sense for the government to give those organizations monies. But at the same time, a number of nonprofit organizations have lost their independence in the process. So it might be that they might think of creative ways to operate their business, to do some fundraising. It might be that they want to feed people using a normal kitchen as opposed to one that meet, restaurant standards, which might be required if you want to serve a large group of people. And so once you've begun receiving money from the government, once you've begun accepting certain money from the government, there are typically a number of rules and regulations that come with that will limit the type of flexibility that you have. And so your incentive as an organization then, if you want to keep the money flowing in, is to do what the government wants you to do, even though it might perhaps be somewhat stupid sometimes, rather than be more creative, try something new, or serve other needs for which obtaining government funding will be more difficult. So again, typically, historically, most nonprofit organizations would rely on voluntary donations, but as they've become increasingly dependent on government funding, a number of people have pointed out that they've lost their autonomy and perhaps are not able to be as creative and as nimble as they might have been in the past. On the other hand, they've got a more secure source of funding, so trade-offs. Okay, the the expressive functions of nonprofits. So expressive are things that are cute, but perhaps not absolutely essential, although obviously some people will disagree with me here. So things like amateur activities in the art, culture, sports, all good for building a community, for getting people involved, for keeping young people out of trouble, etc. They typically attract a volunteer base of support. Again, I don't know how many of you played organized hockey, and I don't know if things have changed a lot in the last few decades, but when I was young and I only played house league, I was not that good, but I mean, you had a number of parents who were obviously involved and volunteer in terms of coaching and organizing hockey-related activities in various ways. Now, out of these activities come musicians, athletes that will probably in some cases make us proud as a country, but the argument is that you develop a community, a sense of community, you get people involved and to do things other than just doing their 9-to-5 job or getting their regular work, and you get them to volunteer and your community benefits as a result. The authors mentioned the multiplier effect on the local economy through related purchasing and facilities. I don't really buy that. I mean, if you spend money on a museum, yes, you will hire people. Yes, you might renovate a building. Yes, you might sell food in there and hire additional employees. But if people don't spend their money on a museum, they'll spend it on something else. And the money will also create other types of jobs. You know, you might create, I don't know what would be popular, some sort of cultural center. You know, you can invest in a theater, you can invest in a hockey arena. Both have an effect on the local economy, so you should always take this argument with a grain of salt. And then they had the multiplier effect for international and national economies. Well, again, if you have a pot of money, if you spend it in something, yes, you know, you'll generate activities, but if you spend it on something else, you'll also generate activities. So I'm not very comfortable with that line of argument. Okay, advocacy organizations. How many of you are familiar with the Lorax? No? Okay, so somebody should have told the Lorax about the tragedy of the commons. I speak for the trees have no tongues. Maybe I should have dug up a video, but the point is that the trees are not being taken care of because they don't belong to anybody. So we've already discussed how to deal with tragedy of open access stories. In a way, the Lorax wants to do advocacy against mismanaging a resource, but again, when a resource does not belong to anyone, either an individual or a community, it's likely to be mismanaged. So a number of NPOs will also speak for human rights, peace and security, and economic policy, as well as the environment. They'll see governance over markets ignored by government policy and or by trying to reshape government policies. So if you hear all this talk about a carbon tax, it really came from the environmentalist movement. I mean, businesses don't like taxes, but once they see it as inevitable, they will probably join the bandwagon and try to show that they behave well. But a number of people argue for, let's say, a $15 minimum wage, for providing more public housing, again, carbon tax, all sorts of things. You've got think tanks, which are in the business of generating ideas. So some of them will be making the case against government interventions. Others will say that government needs to intervene more, to do more in the economy. The funding is primarily for donors and interest group and some service charges. So again, if you want to get back to the protest against pipelines, for example, you go to Alberta, as I have, and you talk to people who are for the pipelines, and they will tell you, well, who funds the activists? Well, it's Saudi Arabia, it's Russia, it's people who don't want to compete with Canadian oil. You talk to activists, they will say, no, it's a grassroots movement, they've taken time off their jobs, they don't want that pipeline in their communities. So sometimes you have people who donate voluntarily to an organization, but it's also true that sometimes you have organizations who want to keep competitors out of business who might actually fund an organization who will say, well, we don't want this or that technology, we don't want this or that product, but it is often the case that there's a more interested reason why some people donate to various advocacy groups. So my favorite example in Quebec is the main organizations that provides local food. If you look for their office, they're in the building of the Quebec Farmers Union. So obviously, Quebec farmers want people in Quebec to buy more food from Quebec, so they can have their campaign along the lines of, good things grow in Ontario, but good things grow in Quebec, or else you can have a more vocal organization that says that buying local food is good for everybody, the environment, the local economy, and obviously it makes sense for Quebec farmers to support organizations who have that message. But then if you look at another lobby group in Canada, by law, we produce more local milk than would be the case if the government was not involved. Who's the main lobby against that? Well, it's typically the restaurants, the people who manufacture frozen pizza and stuff like that, because they would like to get cheese and dairy products for less money. So in their particular case, it makes sense for them to import dairy products from the United States, and so they will sometimes support research that says that we should get rid of the protectionism that we have in our dairy sector. So there are people who act sincerely out of the kindness of their hearts, and you have other people who might have a more interested approach to advocacy organizations. Okay, so there's a global local dynamics of non-governmental organization activism. I won't get into the details, but some of you might have heard about Doctors Without Borders. So some doctors who already work 70 hours a week will sometimes volunteer their holiday time to go work in some place where they're even more needed. You can have nonprofit organizations who specialize in delivering international aid funded by the government. So in that case, they sort of act as an arm of the government, even though they're independent and they're nonprofit organizations. You've got international NGOs like Greenpeace that seeks to reshape local development driven by global concerns. So they will oppose, let's say, building a dam in some less advanced economies, or some countries adopting GMO crops, GMO seeds, or stuff like that. Other NGOs take a different approach. They try to promote things like ethical and fair trade and remapping resources. So ethical and fair trade is something that has been around for a very long time, even before you were born, but it really took off about the time you guys were born. The last 2 decades, I've seen a huge rise in terms of the fair trade movement, even though it existed before. Okay, so table 7.4 describes some non-governmental organizations. Again, human rights, Amnesty International, Oxfam, Doctors Without Borders, environmental issues, so Greenpeace, Sea Shepherd, the Rainforest Action Network. In terms of economic policy in Canada, you've got, and the US, you've got the CDAO Institute, which is pretty much in the center of the political spectrum. The Fraser Institute generally believes that less government is better government. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives believes that more government is better government. As far as I know, the Fraser Institute gets most of its money from private foundations who share these ideas, and corporations like, well, when I was mentioning the case of restaurants being opposed to dairy quotas, a business like that might give to the Fraser Institute because the Institute already has that position, so they believe in that, and there's kind of a convergence of interest. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives gets a lot of money from unions, especially public sector unions. It's staffed by people who believe that government should do more, so again, they're not in the business of saying things that they don't believe in. They already believe that, and it kind of makes sense for organizations whose interests would be well served by that position to give them money. In the US, on the right side, you've got the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., the Hoover Institute, which is based south of San Francisco. Just a quick word about think tanks, either the Fraser Institute or the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. whatever you might think of those organizations, because I spent a few years of my life in the think tank world, I can assure you that on both sides of the political spectrum, people who are there believe what they say. The people who don't believe what they say and will really, be involved in the pay-for-play, people who will say what businesses or particular interests want them to say, work for public relations firms. And this is a very different world, and people who work in public relations typically earn a lot more money than people who work in the think tank world. So again, whether you're on the right or on the left in the think tank world, you're there because you typically believe in what you say. If you're willing to say anything to earn a bigger paycheck, then go work for a public relations firms. Okay, so peace and security, it was a bigger issue a number of decades ago before the Berlin Wall came down. A lot of people were worried about nuclear war, and so there were huge protests and a lot of interest in peace and war issues. Today, yes, we have terrorism, but the threat of nuclear war is obviously much less severe than it was a number of decades ago. So they're not these NGOs are not as prominent as they once were. Okay, so ethical trade. I spent a whole lecture in another course discussing fair trade coffee. I assume that most of you probably know about ethical trade through coffee and perhaps a few other goods. The point here is that you've got consumers who have a lot of money who will pay $5 or $6 for a coffee at Starbucks, and on the other hand, you've got people who don't earn a lot of money who produce the beans, and you've got a bunch of intermediaries in between. So the goal of the ethical trade movement is to make sure that a larger portion of whatever you pay at Starbucks or Second Cup or whatever sort of jumps over the intermediaries and ends up in the pockets of the people who produce your coffee. So this is done through a number of means. You can bring pressures on multinational corporations. You can sort of shame Starbucks into buying more fair trade coffee, for example. You can also encourage the audits of suppliers. Large corporations will often tell you, well, I cannot possibly monitor the thousands of firms that supply me with stuff. As we saw a few weeks ago in a video on China, there are a number of NGOs then that will fill in that role and report to large corporations. The fair trade movement also involves non-governmental organizations who seek higher, more stable prices for primary producers, and fair trade goods increasingly found in supermarkets as well as specialized stores. So you've got a number of NGOs involved in this process. Some might have different ways of reaching a certain objective, but in theory, their goal is always to make sure that the working and the environmental conditions in poor countries are improved. Now, but again, something that you learn as a Catholic boy is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Some approach works better than other, and it's not because people mean well that the mean that they suggest will always deliver the kind of results that they hope for. So with this, as with everything else, I think you should keep a critical mind and try to encourage organizations that do good work, and try to find out if some organizations are promising or saying that they deliver more than they actually do. Okay, I'm sure that you've been lectured about fair trade coffee in a number of other courses. I won't spend too much on time, but again, the point is that between the coffee bar and the producer, there are a number of people, and you want to try to get more resources from this end down to that end. Okay, the resource peripheries. So a lot of poor countries do have valuable natural resources. At the same time, there is an incentive often to develop these resources either in ways that are deemed non-sustainable or in ways that are said not to benefit the local people as much as they should. And there's also often a debate as to whether or not resources should be developed in the first place. The issue here is always, well, if you've got valuable natural resources in an area, and local people want to improve their standards of living. How do you go about this? So the easy way would be to dig a mine, to cut down some trees. But if you don't want to do that, well, are there alternatives available? Are there, again, fair trade schemes that could be developed? Could ecotourism be an alternative? So there's often, again, a lot of controversy around those issues. So you've got conservation and marine protected around the world that will prevent the development of, let's say, underwater petroleum deposits, or will limit fisheries. So this is good for the fish, this is good for the people who don't need those resources to be developed, but if you're poor and you live in this area, perhaps you would be more inclined to support a scheme that tries to reconcile both economic development and protecting natural local areas, but you might be willing to sacrifice a few things, let's say a portion of a conservation area, to develop a resource rather than oppose blanket rejection of any form of development. So again, there are often fights against logging old growth forests, but often, local loggers don't have a problem with logging them down because it pays their mortgage. So again, how do you deal with local loggers with what you can view as a greater environmental good, which would be not to log old growth forests? Okay, we're getting towards the end of the nonprofit sector, social capital and development. This I will ask you to remember because this has increasingly become the rhetorical argument used to justify a number of nonprofit interventions. So what is social capital? Well, it's the aggregate shared values and expectation, the social networks, and the qualities such as trust and willingness to cooperate that makes economic development possible. So again, I don't want to name specific cultures or certain parts of the world, but there are parts of the world you want to do business, sometimes a handshake and a promise are enough. In other parts of the world, well, you might want to get some lawyers involved. And in other parts of the world, when you try to do business, you try to minimize the amount by which you'll be screwed by local authorities. So some places are both open for business and people respect institutions and respect the property of others. In other parts of the world, you might have, I don't know, a policeman at every block who expect to be tipped or to be bribed by a rich foreigner. So these things do matter in the long run because on the one hand, if you want to develop natural resources, if you want to build a mine, for example, well, you've got both the quality of the local deposits in any location, you've got the price of that commodity on the international market, but at the same time, you've got the local politics that you've got to deal with. And if everything else is equal, if you're an investor, you obviously want to put your money in the place where you're least likely to have your installations being taken away from you. So, for example, a few years ago, the Russian government decided it was just going to seize the assets of a large multinational petroleum corporations. So it might benefit the local politicians in the short run, but what kind of message does it send to foreign investors? And let's say that you want to invest in the development of petroleum or natural gas, and I will just forget about whether or not this should be done in the first place, assuming this should be done. Are you more likely to invest in Russia, where something like that happened, or to a place like Alberta, where once you invest, you can be fairly sure that whatever the local government does, it won't steal your equipment? So again, these things do matter. So in that context, what NGOs and NPOs are said is that they facilitate the creation of social capital, a society in which people volunteer in everything from little leagues to building hospitals and museums and caring for less fortunate people. A society where these things are common will generally be a society where the level of trust among people is higher. And the more trust you have in a society, the more confident you can feel as an investor in terms of putting your money and your resources in that particular location. And so social capital does matter, and the argument is that the nonprofit sector plays a crucial role in developing trust, respect, and a forward-looking mindset in which people feel that they belong to a society where everybody benefits when things happen, and not just the tiny minority who reap all the rewards and dump all the problems onto other people. Okay, so again, this is kind of a take on that. The authors tell you much about trust, cooperation, reciprocity. These things, though, need to be created in the first place. I mean, the default organizations of human historically has been a rather small tribe, and you tend to distrust the people from the next tribe. We now live in a society where, at least in the Western, at least in a place like Canada, North America, most migrants came to this country and rejected, or at least wanted to forget the tribe which they came from, and they wanted to be something else. And so it doesn't quite matter what your cultural or ethnic background is. Among Canadians, we tend to trust each other to a large extent. But these things need to be maintained and developed over time. So as long as we have social norms by which we abide, and social capital is like everything else. It's like a garden. It needs to be replanted on a regular basis. It needs to be taken care of. And it is in that context, again, that social capital and the nonprofit sector, the role of the nonprofit sector in sort of watering and maintaining social capital is viewed as crucial. Okay, I'll spare you that. I've been discussing most of these issues. Well, perhaps I could say something about negative social capital. So if you're in a society where people still mostly feel like they belong to a group as opposed to another, there was a war not too long ago, or let's say you're in a society where nonprofit institutions were destroyed in the past, like say the Soviet Union. I mean, I've got to be careful when I say this. I get in trouble often enough, but I spent some time in Russia a few years ago, and one thing that struck me, and perhaps this is the experience of some of you too, is how much people distrust each other. And well, one explanation is that, well, historically they had, of course, a feudal system which is not very conducive to trust. Then they had communism and central planning for a while, which destroyed all other institutions, and where you were often rewarded to rat on your neighbors who was not friendly to the regime or something. And so these things take a long time, even though communism officially disappeared in Russia a generation ago. Recreating a social fabric, creating social capital, is something that is very difficult to do. And so these things can be created, but once the dynamic is negative, once people stop trusting each other, getting them to trust each other is quite a challenge. At least it struck me as so when I was there a while back. Okay, development and gross national happiness. This, honestly, I have a problem with. So the authors discussed the case of Bhutan, who's used an index based on sustainable and equitable socio-economic development, environmental conservation, preservation and promotion of culture and good governance, which is all good, but honestly, when you can't afford to build a hospital and your children mortality is kind of high, I mean, it's nice to have lofty goals and promote culture, but at the same time, hospitals, medicine, and comprehensive education kind of do matter a bit. So a lot of people point out, and this is a valid criticism, that the gross domestic product does not measure everything, which is true. There are alternative index, but at the same time, I don't believe you can completely ignore basic economic realities. So there are things, there are other indexes, like for example, the Genuine Progress Indicator that attempts to measure social capital, but honestly, we know that social capital exists. We know it's out there, or you notice it when it's not there, but how do you actually measure the thing? And this is where, again, the problems are in the details. So yes, the GDP is not perfect. Other indicators were developed, but they have issues of their own. So, okay. So in conclusion, NPOs and NGOs these days do a lot of things that government businesses and households cannot or will not do. It often makes sense to create a nonprofit organization to organize things at a level that is beyond the household but below what the state will provide. They do involve a lot of people, either as paid members of an NPO or else as volunteers for an organization. There's a great diversity of organizations. Some of them talk a lot, others do more and are less present in the media. They get money from all sorts of sources, government income, fees, and donations. But there's always an issue, if the majority of their funding comes from the government, do they, in a sense, become a lower paid branch of the government? Or are they still, do they still have enough freedom to try to change their mission or to adapt their mission or to adapt approaches that would not be in line with government guidelines? Be that as it may, the nonprofit sector is said to be crucial in the building of social capital. Okay, so I'm sorry if this was a bit dry, but we needed to cover the basic issues, and I'm running a bit behind schedule at this point. Anything I said you want to strongly disagree with? How many of you will never buy fair trade coffee because you're too cheap? Or you believe it's not worth your money? Okay, fair enough. Well, if you ever take my other class, we'll have a more controversial discussion on that. Okay. Okay, something that would seem more relevant to, well, not that unique, well, okay, I'll tell you anyway. So I was one of the reviewers for the second edition of that textbook, and I was like, why do you spend a whole chapter on nonprofit organization? There's already way too much material for a semester. Perhaps we could discuss that in another context and cut a chapter or two, but you can't see it had no impact whatsoever. So if you see the list of people thanked at the beginning of the textbook, my name is not there, and there's a reason for that, even though I did the work. Okay, so cities, something that I'm really more passionate and knowledgeable about. So, any history majors here? Herodotus, familiar with him? You obviously have the date here. Perhaps I should not have put it, but he's a Greek fellow who was involved in a few wars a long, long time ago, wrote about them. But if you read the original text, you will see that he also discusses the reality of the Greek world over 2 millennia ago. And he says at one point, I will tell the story as I go along of small cities no less than of great. Most of those which were great once are small today, and those which in my own lifetime have grown to greatness were small enough in the old days. Now what he's referring to is the Greek-speaking world of, again, over 2,000 years ago. So you might be familiar with places like Athens and Sparta, which should be down here, which it isn't because it's a map from an earlier period of time before Sparta became significant. But he knows this world very well, and he can travel from one island to what is now the western coast of Turkey to up in what is now part of Bulgaria, or perhaps even the Crimea, which till not too long ago was Ukrainian, is now Russian, back and forth. And he sees flourishing settlements, but also the ruins of cities that were abandoned maybe 1,000 or even 2,000 years before. And so even though things were much slower in those days, even though there were much less people in the world than there are today, you can see that some cities grow and prosper for a while, and that others that were prosperous went by the wayside and left a few nice ruins, but there's not much left other than that. And again, the point of this is that this was long before Jesus Christ and Mahomet came along, hundreds of years before. So again, as I was telling you, the economy is a process. Things grow, things decline, and nothing can be taken for granted. So if you were born and raised in Toronto, you believe rightly that Toronto is the center of the Canadian universe, and everybody else in the country hates us, which is kind of true. But at the same time, if you had been born a century ago, Toronto wasn't much. Montreal was much bigger. And a century ago, actually, Buffalo was viewed as a modern city, and Toronto was something of a backwater. I mean, Buffalo. Well, no disrespect to Buffalo, but if you visited the city, for example, their botanical garden or some of their more ancient building, you can see that Buffalo was very prosperous a number of decades ago based on the architecture of the buildings. But obviously, Toronto never stopped growing, whereas Buffalo has been declining for a while. And so again, you cannot take anything for granted in life. Either you run, because if you stop running, other people will pass you by. So what the authors do in that chapter is to discuss the local and non-local dynamics that explain the growth of the city. So in terms of local factor, is it a good place to launch a business? Or in terms of external factors, if you're the world center for the production of something that turns out to be valuable in a new technology, it might be that external demand will really improve the profitability of your local businesses. So either you generate businesses or there's outside demand for what you already do and then you grow. So these are basically the two dynamics that explain city growth. Okay, so they have a few words on cities as places, the factors that shape their diversification, industrial and creative cities, urban systems, and the like. Again, the treatment is very broad, a bit too much for my taste, but we needed to discuss the nonprofit sector. And with this comment, I will get back to the normal program. Okay, so the wealth of cities. So as I was telling you earlier in the semester, there's never been any episodes of sustained economic growth, even going back to the time of Herodotus, that did not create cities. You cannot find, I mean, the closest exception you would have would be a place like, let's say, Saudi Arabia, where you're a poor backwater until roughly 1935, and then suddenly people discover a lot of petroleum under the sand, and there's a huge world demand for it. So yes, you can become very wealthy, but are you developed? So what is it that they manufacture in Saudi Arabia exactly that they don't import from other places? Do they manufacture cars? Do they manufacture electronic devices? Do they produce a lot of food to begin with? So yes, they'll build a lot, and a few people in Saudi Arabia will have a ton of money. You will have a number of foreign workers who will make a decent living. You'll have a number of foreign workers who, well, don't have a very pleasant existence. But as was the case about 20 years ago in the mid-1990s, when oil prices sank to an all-time low, the fate of Saudi Arabia at the time was really problematic. So it's not like they had something else to fall back upon. So yes, you've got concentrations of people in Saudi Arabia, so you've got cities, but you've got a lot of people who are paid to do not much. You don't really have a thriving economy outside of the energy sector. But historically, every time you've had a number of business emerge, a number of new things being created, you had cities. So cities, in a way, are meeting places. So these are symbols for cities here in different culture. I don't remember which one is which, but one is Chinese, one is Egyptian, one is Middle Eastern, and the other, I believe, is Greek. But I mean ancient Greek, before the alphabet was invented. And these are people who didn't know each other, but when they had to describe a city, they all came up with the same idea. A city is where at least two important roads meet and where people gather and trade. So towns are crossroads. Cities are meeting places for all kinds of exchanges, and cities are agglomerations of diverse markets. So people go to city to trade for food, to trade for jewelry, to trade for weapons, to trade for agricultural equipment. They will trade for building materials. Historically, again, go back to the time of Herodotus, and you would have several markets in cities, not just one particular type of good that would be traded. And that's because getting all those people together reduces transaction costs. It makes sense to go to one location that will provide you with a wide range of goods and services. And so cities have always been at the heart and have always organized global value chains. Now, the way they describe this is to describe cities as the cause and effect of localization and urbanization, these economies of scale, which are concepts that we've discussed before. Cities integrate diverse markets, and city accumulate infrastructure, human capital, and resources. But what we see historically is that the more prosperous a city is, the more it diversifies, the more it gets stuck into one line of work, the more it will, the more it specializes in one line of work, the higher the probabilities are that it will lose its market and decline over time. So again, I don't want to remain too local, but across the lake here, you've got the city of Rochester, which is here east of Buffalo in upstate New York. Now, a century ago, Rochester was probably one of the two main science and R&D hubs in North America. It had businesses like Kodak, Xerox, and Bosch and Lomb. How many of you are familiar with Kodak? Okay, vaguely. So when I was a kid, everybody knew what Kodak was. You wanted to take a picture and you needed to print it on film. Kodak had the market to itself. Then the Japanese came in, but for a while, Kodak was something that everybody knew. And we had expressions like Kid Kodak, which is people who like to have their picture taken. So if any of you have been to Montreal, you might know that the mayor's name is Denis Coderre. I should have included his picture, so people like to call him Kid Coderre because he likes to have his picture taken. Okay, sorry, that's too inside baseball for Montrealers. The other business was Xerox. How many of you are familiar with Xerox? Okay, old-fashioned, before even the fax machine came along, Xerox was the main name in photocopying machines. Our relevance, we still print a lot of things on paper, but less than in the past, and so their business model obviously suffered. Now, Bosch and Lomb was in the business of producing nautical equipment, thing related to lenses and stuff, and so eventually they branched into making contact lenses and stuff like that. So they're still in that business. They still do medical equipment. They're still doing well. But if you go to Rochester today, the housing is very affordable. That's because, once Kodak that dominated the city fell apart, there wasn't much else to fall back upon. You had Xerox and Bosch and Lomb. Well, Xerox lost a big share of its market. Bosch and Lomb, competition came along from Germany, from Japan, from elsewhere. The things that stayed there are the universities. They've got two decent universities in town, which became good because of those other businesses. But at the same time, if, again, you specialize in one or a few sectors and you don't generate new businesses all the time, eventually most cities will experience the fate of Rochester. A city like Toronto's strength is how diverse it is and how many businesses it has generated over time. Okay. So cities are global and local. So obviously you buy stuff from local suppliers, and by that I mean not only your grocery store, but if you're a business that produces anything, even if you develop apps in your basement, chances are, unless you buy everything online, that you will buy chairs, furniture, whatever, from local businesses. But at the same time, chances are that your customers will, unless you're in the service sector and you run a restaurant or something like that, chances are that your customers will be located outside of your city. So again, cities are crossroads where both local and global markets interact. So in that context, markets and agglomerations are interdependent. They're shaped by specialist function, institutions, and infrastructure in a path-dependent relationship. So an old-fashioned economic model that they discuss in the textbook discusses how, for example, when you've got a more diverse economy, as I was telling you a few weeks ago, when a new firm moves in, it will generate more activity because it will find it more convenient to buy things locally. But if you move to a city that does not have a very diversified base, well, you will tend to import things from further away. But these things change over time. Okay, so make a note for figure 8.1. I'm not quite sure I will quiz you on that, but I might. So this is again an old-fashioned business, or at least economic geography model that tries to explain city growth based on exports. So you've got locally both agglomeration and agglomeration economies and diseconomies, and you've got both localization, so related to one particular sector, and urbanization related to many economic sectors. And once you generate exports to other markets, well, you tend to grow your city. You've got locally owned, national, global, representative, institutions, global. So anyway, it's not a figure that I like a lot. I'll stop complaining about the textbook. I should write my own if I'm so unhappy. But the idea that they're trying to convey here is that of local and global linkages. So again, make a note for figure 8.1. I'm still not sure if I'll quiz you on this one or not. Okay, so the local inputs into the city economy. So the urban form is influenced by a number of things: community plans, transportation networks, related policies and regulations. So you're all from Mississauga. Do you know why Square One or the area around Square One looks the way it does and not other parts of the city? Well, among other things, because Mayor McCallion and her team decided a while ago that you would have unlimited height and density in that particular section of the city. Well, many people want to live in Toronto, and so when you're told that, you realize that the real estate market is expensive. The only thing that young people can afford are condos. It might be that parents, once their kids are done, want to cash in on the value of their house, move into a condo or something. And so a number of real estate developers saw the opportunity to build large structures. Well, it's not like they could build them anywhere they wanted. One location in which they could do that was the area around Square One, which is why you've got all these big condo projects there. You could not build some of these structures in other part of the city because they're not zoned for building to unlimited height and density. Okay, so these things do influence the form that a city will have. In terms of urban diversification, well, they're shaped by agglomeration economies and path dependencies, more on that in a minute. And there's always also the issue of spatial inequalities. So if you're geography majors, I don't know if they still do surveys of Malton, not Milton, Malton, but I mean, if you know anything about Mississauga, and I assume you do, you know that Malton historically has been kind of isolated from the rest of the city, and that they've not had the same level of access to services or the same level of wealth as many other parts of the city. Now, there is a virtuous circle. When an economy develops, success breeds success. A business that grows will tend typically to spin off other startup businesses that will find other niches. But the thing works the other way around too. So once a city begins to decline, like Rochester or Detroit, not too far from here, once the main businesses move out of the city, it's very hard to stop that the industrialization or disinvestment cycle. So I don't know how many of you have ever done, some call it decay porn or architectural porn in Detroit. Detroit was obviously very prosperous at one point in time. In the post-World War II era, it was arguably the richest city in the United States. Car manufacturers were paying very well. Huge structures were built. But, you know, it's funny because if you're like me, I don't know, I like industrial museums, and that's why I went to Detroit to visit, you know, some. They've got some fantastic museum if you're into things like the history of locomotives or the history of cars and stuff like that. But it's kind of hard, apart from the downtown area by the water, not to run into neighborhoods that don't look too good. So you might have a pocket that looks okay, let's say around a university, you might have the downtown pocket, you might have the museum over here, and it's kind of hard though not to see things like that when you drive around, which is a shame because you can see all the wealth that was there in beautiful buildings that were abandoned. I lived for 2 years in Baltimore, east of Washington, D.C., which was also once prosperous, but has a few neighborhoods that look like that, but nothing on the scale of Detroit, of course. So anyway, there are many reasons why Detroit turned out the way it did. I won't get into those, but the point is that once the decline begins, it's very difficult to stop. I mean, there's plenty of affordable real estate in Detroit, but there's a reason why nobody lives in these houses, for example. And I'm not gonna go into the reasons here. Okay, but when things are good, again, success tends to breed success. I've already told you about localization economies, the multiplier effects. The authors also discussed Jacobs' externalities in the textbook. I happen to have written my doctoral dissertation on Jacobs' externality, and that's the last time I told about my input into that book, but the authors didn't know what they were talking about, so now the definition that you have is the right one. Okay, so what are these things about? So if you're not familiar with Jane Jacobs, she's an American lady who moved to Toronto around the time I was born, so that was a long time ago, the late 1960s, who argued that what really matters in a city is competition between small firms, but also diversity, because ideas developed to solve one type of problem can often be used in other sectors. But because specialists in one area often have difficulties communicating with people in other areas, being close physically often facilitates knowledge creation. So long story short, she was a university dropout, she had no degrees, and her theories were tested against Nobel Prize winners, including this one here, Kenneth Arrow, who died a few years ago, and she came out on top. The problem is that nobody really went beyond what she said in terms of examining how these things actually happen. And this is where this young man here came along. I don't know if you see the hair here, so yes, age is not always kind to people. So, this is the part where you have to listen to my doctoral dissertation, but the advantage you have is that I'm now going to give you material you will be quizzed on that is not available anywhere else but on these slides, so bear with me. And before you think that my thesis was too silly, I'm kind of oversimplifying things and in order to give you manageable questions. Okay, so if I ask you, how does your professor synthesizes the technical creativity process? Well, this is what I want to see. So, can you see patterns among creative people? Yes, you can. Or, yes, I heard you. So, without boring you with the detail, I talked to a bunch of inventors and engineers, and I read a fair amount on the topic. And if there is something that is obvious for every technically creative people, is that the starting point of any invention is a problem. Something that you get the gut feeling could work better, do more, sell better, be more appealing. So some sort of deficiency in terms of the way a device works. Now, pretty much all human beings are like that. When we see a problem, we look for a solution. But it obviously first makes sense to look into what you already know. So I don't know, if I was to run into, well, let's say I want to write something on the board, I break the chalk, what's the solution? Obviously, I look for another chalk, I don't even think about it. But what if I deal with a problem I've never encountered before? What am I going to do? Well, my first reflex, my first mode of action in terms of dealing with it will be to build on what I already know. So that might be enough for some types of problems, but often it isn't. But the problem is serious enough that you need to come up with a solution. And this is where you begin to learn or to observe other things. and I'll tell you more about analogical reasoning in a few minutes, but you often learn by observing and by adapting the basic design of a solution to a problem and adapting it to solve another type of problem. Now, because we're not in the realm of pure mathematics, you need to do a lot of trial and error to test ideas, to refine things, to soften the edges, what have you. And the solution is always a new combinations of things that existed to create a lesser problem that existed before. But because nothing is perfect, you or somebody else will realize, well, there should be a better way to do this, and the process starts over and over and over again. So I'll spare you the details. I talked to a bunch of French Canadians. I should say male because the world of invention is still heavily male dominated. So that was in the late 1990s. Most of them did not speak English. The internet was only beginning, so there's only so much these people would have in terms of outside influence. So obviously, you could document these processes, but the kind of cultural references of those people was kind of limited. And then, well, Ontario taxpayers were kind enough to give me enough money to do something similar in Southern Ontario. Okay, so things that you take for granted today had to be invented at one point in time. And so I talked to one of the first inventors who had the idea to combine a Christmas tree and fiber optic. Now this is obviously an old design here, but he had the idea by visiting an optical fiber optic exhibit around Christmas time. So you see a Christmas tree, you see fiber optic, you see, oh, I could come up with a better Christmas tree, and you've got the designs that you've become familiar with. Again, these are early prototypes, but this is how things worked at the time. In Montreal, as in Toronto, space was at a premium. A number of people were converting their garages into offices. And so somebody had the idea to combine doors, regular doors, with garage doors. I don't know if these products are around. Did that ever take off? I've never seen those. So anyway, those two French Canadian guys came up with this idea. That's their prototype here. So you can convert your garage easily. You want to convert it into an office, you've got your door, you change your mind, you can move your car in. So they visited the only big garage door manufacturer in Montreal who told them that for some reason only Italians would buy that, and the idea never went anywhere. Now before you accuse me of being racist and saying bad things about Italian, that's what they were told. I'm just repeating what I was told at the time. I have no opinion on this. Okay. An earwig trap, some of you might have seen that. I talked to the guy who developed that. Can you guess what the original inspiration was in terms of design? No. Well, in a way, yes, but the shape. A hockey puck. Canadians. I know this is Mississauga, but it's a hockey puck. He was thinking, okay, how could I design a mouse trap for pucks? Played hockey. Oh, okay, yeah, sure. So that's a hockey puck and a mousetrap, if you will, converted into an earwig trap. Job mobility between industries. So if you're technically creative, typically you don't end up in management. There's nothing that you hate more than pushing paper around or managing people. So a common characteristic of technically creative people is that they get bored after a few years and they move between different jobs. And so I talked to a guy who ended up working in the newspaper business at the time where newspaper were still printed on paper, was in charge of cleaning up their tanks, among other things, got bored, goes work for an asphalt manufacturer. And the problem you have with those big asphalt tanks is that when you stop at Christmas, Easter, for maintenance or whatever, you always have asphalt that is stuck within those kind of big containers. And so you needed to send people in there with shovels or whatever to sort of scrape the asphalt. So the guy comes over from the newspaper business and goes, well, that's crazy. Why don't you just put hot water in it, as we do, the newspaper business? And suddenly you don't need to send people to clean up the asphalt tanks. You save a lot of money. You don't damage your equipment. All sorts of little things like that happen all the time between sectors that have apparently very little in common. Okay, bicycle design. So again, this is like 20 years ago, so these basic designs have been around for a while, but I'll spare you the career path of this fellow. Let's just say that he worked for a truck assembly plant, a pulp and paper mill, a sawmill, railroad wagon design, and he said that he brought knowledge that he had acquired in all those fields into designing a new and better bicycle. But in that case, the design might be better, it might be more ergonomic, but honestly, I'm not sure I would like to be on Burnhamthorpe on that bicycle when you see all the big SUVs flying by. I used to bike to this campus until maybe a decade ago, and it was dangerous enough when I was higher. I'm not sure that I would like to be at that level. Okay, so please take notes again. What did your professor conclude as a young PhD student? Well, local diversity obviously matters in terms of the opportunities that people are given to acquire skills beyond the kind of generate knowledge you learn at a school. So if you live in a reasonably diversified economies, well, you have the opportunity to learn from diverse businesses, at least if you move between them. You also meet people in different lines of work with different kinds of expertise. You can interact with people much more easily. And again, the key issue here is that you might be very knowledgeable about something very specific. Somebody else might be very knowledgeable about something specific, but being able to communicate when your expertise are so different requires a lot of face-to-face interaction, a lot of communication. And so communicating the type of knowledge that is not on paper, that is not in electronic form, requires people with different expertise to talk to each other a lot. And at the same time, well, the more diversified your economy is, the more you can find bits and pieces of work and knowledge that will help you create a new combination. Again, not rocket science, but sometimes a doctoral dissertation is to document something that might be kind of obvious, but that nobody has documented before. So if some of you think you're PhD material, sometimes you don't need to reinvent the wheel, you just need to notice what goes on around you. Okay. Any questions? I used to bring all sorts of little gadgets, but I'm running behind. I documented, like, I don't know, about 70 inventions. I kept about 10 with me, but I'm not bringing them to class anymore. Okay, so cities and innovation. So you now have an inkling as to why cities make people more productive. So you've got smart, creative people next to, or who have the capacity to interact with other smart, creative people, and on a scale that you will not have in a small town. Then you understand why historically most inventions, most innovations were developed in cities. So it's not only having smart people, but having a bunch of different resources around you. But then you can look at this in two ways. You can say, well, what you have today is more of what you have in the past. You know, there are more people, more industries, more things, which does not get you very far if you want to make money as a consultant. Or you can say that, you know, the present is unlike the past and everything that happened before is kind of irrelevant for the new reality. So if you believe in the creative cities of the 21st century that are based on things that did not exist before, on a creative class that somehow did not exist before, then you can say that there was a rupture with the past. But I'm personally critical of that line of thought. What is not questionable, though, is that cities come in systems, and what I mean by that is that while development in the past never occurred without cities emerging, you always had something of an order between cities. So you always had one city that was much bigger than the others, then you had regional cities that were of a certain size, then you had smaller towns of a certain size around those cities of a certain size, and then you had small villages and what have you. So cities have never come in a kind of a uniform distribution in terms of size. You always had a hierarchy of more important places, less important, and all of these were kind of integrated within a systems of cities in terms of flows of goods, services, people, information, and finance. Okay, so the size distribution of city varies among countries, but there is a size distribution in every economy. So city size rankings are relatively stable over time. So if you go to France, Paris has dominated France for about 1,000 years. London is about the same. In the United Kingdom, Stockholm in Sweden has long been the largest city. But in some places, things do change. So for example, when the United States began at the time of the Revolutionary War, the biggest city was not New York, but Philadelphia. But a few decades later, New York overtook Philadelphia and has remained the largest city since then. If you look at the west coast of the United States, San Francisco was at first the most important city of California, but then Los Angeles took over. In the American Midwest, St. Louis was originally the most important city, but then Chicago emerged and overtook St. Louis. But once a city has established itself, it's very rare that it loses its top position. So I've given you a few examples of that. In Canada, we saw that with Toronto overtaking Montreal. But if you talk to Montrealers or ex-Montrealers, they will tell you that Toronto overtook Montreal because the best people in Montreal, left Montreal and came to Toronto. But you might have a different take on that. You're too young. If I tell you the old joke, 101 means 401, does that tell you anything? When the Parti Québécois took over in the 1970s and mandated French-only signs, it was kind of the tipping point for a number of Anglos who had remained in Montreal, and a number of them had left in the previous decade. They came, and a large part, most of the Anglo elite in Montreal left, relocated to Toronto, and this, they will tell you, is why Toronto became a livable city, because Anglo-Montrealers moved in and made something out of it. Now, whether you agree with that or not depends, I guess, on what your cultural history is, but that's a story that's often told by ex-Montrealers. Okay, so the Canadian urban hierarchy. By 1971, Montreal is still bigger than Toronto in terms of population. Although, truth be told, Toronto has a system of city around it, places like Hamilton, Guelph, Kitchener, Waterloo, even Kingston to some extent, that you don't have around Montreal. Montreal is a big city and you've got small nothing towns around it, whereas Toronto is a large city with sizable smaller cities surrounding it. So other than that, well, Vancouver remains in third place, but one other change in the Canadian hierarchy over the last few years has been the rise of Alberta. So for most of Canadian history, Vancouver was number 3, Ottawa was number 4, but with the resource boom in Alberta, Calgary and Edmonton grew like crazy for a while. And even a number of businesses in Toronto relocated to Calgary these last few years. But the rest of the Canadian hierarchy is reasonably stable. There's this old joke about Winnipeg. It's been at 666,000 people for about 4 decades. But, okay, forget it. So continental and world cities. So the authors discuss world cities, so places that are so huge that they determine really much of the organization of the global economic map. The authors refer to a classification that refers to alpha, beta, and gamma cities, which makes you an alpha as opposed to a beta. Well, things like the number of multinational corporations headquartered in your city, the size of your financial service sector, research and development organizations. But it's not because a city is large and provides a lot of opportunities that it is necessarily considered the most livable. Real estate might be outrageous, traffic congestion might be really bad, so these things also are also important. Okay, so in terms of the ranking of world cities. Two really stand out. They're not the most important in terms of population, but they're certainly the most important in terms of the financial sector and the cultural influence that they have on the rest of the world. So, and these are obviously London and New York. Then you've got large and important cities that are important globally, but are not quite in the league of London and New York. So Paris, Tokyo, which is bigger than London, and depending on the measure you use, bigger than New York City, but still a lot of Japanese firms. I mean, Japanese are less open to the world than those two other places. Hong Kong, Singapore, and the newcomers, Beijing and Shanghai, which were always big, but only became economically significant on a global scale in the recent past. Then you've got alpha cities, so Chicago, Mumbai, Milan, Moscow, Sao Paulo in Brazil, Frankfurt, Toronto, this is where we belong, Los Angeles, Madrid, Mexico City, Amsterdam, Kuala Lumpur, and a few others. Then you've got alpha minus, so Seoul, San Francisco, although with Silicon Valley, I'm not quite sure San Francisco belongs there. Zurich, Buenos Aires, Johannesburg, Vienna, Istanbul, Jakarta, Warsaw, Washington, Bangkok. Washington might be considered an alpha minus, but when you understand the importance of American politics, perhaps, again, it could be ranked some other place. And then you've got beta world cities. So this is where Montreal is, for example, comparable to Rome, Tel Aviv, Berlin, Philadelphia, Houston, and then a few others. Okay, so again, I was telling you that cities are crossroads. They integrate multiple flows, institutions, and land use. But ultimately, cities are commercial creatures. So the way people, the reason why people move to cities is because of opportunities. But once economic activities are created in the cities, well, people measure various trade-offs in terms of locating their businesses, in terms of where they live. And the results are remarkably similar throughout histories and among different cities today. Certain regions, certain zones in the city will be typically taken over by the financial sectors, other by the manufacturing sector, and so on and so forth. So urban land markets, the interaction of supply and demand for both commercial and residential activities are the same pretty much the world over. They're influenced by various factors, you know, how corrupt are local politicians, or is there a no-growth area that is preserved for its environmental value, for example. But by and large, the results are remarkably similar the world over. So a few words on bid-rent theory. This I will ask you to remember. I try to avoid technical issues in that course or technical theories, but this one is at a level that it should be useful to you. So this is the way an economist would look at urban land markets. And I don't think that supply and demand are optional. I mean, obviously, as long as we live in a market economy, supply and demand will determine how things are organized in geographical space. So the theory is that it is a way to think or to conceptualize how land uses would be spatially organized in perfectly competitive markets. So you have money, you have perfect knowledge, you want to bid and occupy a particular location in the cities. And so in a market, what happens is that everybody bids like an auction on a piece of land or on a particular building, and land uses are then allocated to the highest bidder, and competition is driven by accessibility. Okay, so why would you want to locate your business in a particular zone or area of the city, or perhaps even in a particular building? Well, obviously, because you expect that you will earn more value from that location that you will have to spend for it. So it's not because a rent price will be high that it will not be profitable. You might say, you might talk to politicians who will say, well, why don't you relocate to my suburb? Rents are cheap. But then a question you need to ask yourselves, yeah, why are they cheap? And will you get your money's worth if you buy or if you rent a particular space in a particular location? So it's not because you pay more that you will necessarily have a tough time making profit. It might be that it will be more profitable to be in a location where you pay more, and the fact that you pay more for that location is because, well, there are more opportunities for business. So within the central business district, the place with the most accessible places command the highest land values. So I don't know how many of you work downtown or will one day, but obviously, if you're located next to Union Station, well, there's an advantage to be there. I mean, people can come from the suburbs, and if they can walk over to their office, you're more likely to be able to hire people who would rather not take the subway once they get downtown to go to work. And so people who can afford to pay more will tend to locate close to Union Station if they can. And what you see emerging there is obviously the fact that the people who can pay the most in the city are in the financial sector, and this is why you've got a lot of these things around a place like Union Station. But in this day and age, often what matters more is location next to a main highway exit, which is why, for example, if you go up, is it Erin Mills or your Ontario, you've got Microsoft Canada. Well, for a business like Microsoft, it's easier to get employees if you're located by a big highway close to an exit. Because most people live in the suburb, they want to commute in the suburbs, you won't get them out of their cars. Well, among other things, there's the prestige of working at Microsoft, but part of the appeal too is that the commute to your work is relatively easy as opposed to other locations that they could have chosen. So in that context, the bid rate gradients define how land values decline with distance from the central business district and other centers. Okay, so that's the traditional model in terms of what was called, well, let's say the conventional land occupation. So you would have a central business district, and the further away you went from it, the less valuable land would become. And so businesses would locate, and this I will ask you to remember though, I mean, figure 8.3, it's intuitive, it's not too difficult. You can see the bid rent allocation of land uses. Well, downtown what you've got is the finance, business, service industry. And because they can pay more for the land and they have an incentive to be located where people can easily commute. Then you've got high-end retail and services. Well, you know, again, you live in a world that is very different than the old model, but there's a reason why the Eaton Center was built where it was built and not in the middle of nowhere. Then the further out you move, warehousing and then residential. Okay, so distance, land rent, finance services, high-end retail and services, warehousing and residential, which are all further away. Because there's no way even a very wealthy person can outbid the headquarters of the Royal Bank of Canada, for example. Okay, so the bid rent drivers land use pattern. So central business district with the highest land values, please remember this. You can expect a fairly detailed question of bid rent. So stimulate high density residential or commercial uses by demanders that desire accessibility. Suburban residential choices involve substitution of lower land costs for higher accessibility costs. So if you want to live downtown in a condo, that's one thing, but if you have kids and you want a backyard, well, obviously you can't afford that downtown. You need to move out to be able to afford a house with a little bit of grass in the back. So historically, transportation networks have reinforced the accessibility of central business district. There's a reason why Union Station is there, and there's a reason why everything converged to the central location. But what began emerging before you were born were suburban centers. So again, the area around Square One or concentrations of businesses in other parts of the GTA are fairly typical. So this was the old-fashioned model, the central business district, and the value of the land goes down the further away you get. But what emerged with highways, especially, was the creation of suburban centers, like the area around Square One. So the way we describe that today is that we now live in something of a star model, where people often commute from suburb to suburbs rather than going downtown, even though the central business district might be important. But even in a case like Toronto, you have some studies who tell you that, for example, you've got more jobs around the airport now than you have close to Union Station. So historically, everything converged. In the age of rail, everything converged on the central business district. In the age of cars and highway, you've got a number of suburban centers. And again, a key issue here is accessibility in terms of reducing transaction and transportation costs and facilitating commuting. So this is a map of New York City, which got into this even before Toronto. So this is Manhattan. The main central business district of Manhattan was historically here at the tip of the island. But if you drive around New York City, you will see, seeing Manhattan from New Jersey is actually a pretty spectacular sight, but you can see that, there's a concentration of building downtown here. And it was beginning to emerge on this picture into Midtown over here, which is where most of the TV stations are, among other things. And a lot of firms have begun relocating from Wall Street, which was down here, to Midtown. But if you drive around New York City, you will see a number of places that kind of look like Square One today. So a number of businesses, large buildings. And these emerge as a result of the same phenomenon, but in an age of cars and highways. And again, these edge cities are something that you're familiar with, but honestly, they only began emerging a little bit before you were born. People began noticing them in the 1980s. But you've got car-oriented development, you get this model, and you had the rail development, well, you got the old-fashioned model. But obviously, despite various attempts and guilt trips and others, people don't want to get out of their car. Typically what they want is other people to get out of their car so that there will be less traffic on the highway. So, like it or not, I think the demonstrated behavior of a lot of people is that you won't get people out of their car. We're in the suburbs, I don't need to tell you that. This is less controversial than saying that at St. George, I guess. And what you see more and more of are these suburban edge cities around the old district. Okay, that was a lot of information and not a lot of time, so I'll let you go. I have office hours in geography today for once. I'll be in my office if you want to talk to me. If you came in late, and you did not pick up your turn test, they're there. Questions will be posted soon. Other than that, don't wait at the last minute to work on your term paper. And I'll see you next time.